Thank you so much, Shail, for agreeing to be on this podcast. Just to give a background, Shail has been an award-winning journalist and has worked in the media space for over a decade now. Right from the Times of India to the Hindustan Times, Star Sports, and so on. Presently, he works as an independent journalist with a range of publications, including Mint, The Hindu, Al Jazeera, and so on. So thank you, Shail, for being on this podcast. As we discussed, the idea of this podcast is to discuss about how NGOs and non-profits and social enterprises, how can essentially they be better when it comes to pitching stories to publications. So it would be wonderful to get your insights on this.
Thank you for having me here, Simit, and I hope I can shed some light on how NGOs could better pitch their stories and get their work out in the mainstream media.
Both of us go a long way, right? Like we started in the same publication in the same media house, which is the Times of India. That was when was that? That was way back in 2019, right?
No, it's 2008. I think.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that was 2008-9.
Yeah.
It's been a long way, isn't it?
I hope we're going to talk a lot about some of the basics that we learned back then, because I'm pretty sure it'll help NGOs in terms of just how you approach a story, because everyone does work, but so many times you don't know how to kind of explain this to another person. So I'm pretty sure we're going to go back to a lot of the basic journalism that we studied and practiced back then.
Absolutely. In fact, we happen to also have studied in the same journalism school. So one of the things that our director back then, which is Mr. Abhay Mukashi, would tell us is, the basics, very basics of journalism, which is 5 W's and 1 H. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. So 5 W's and 1 H will essentially help you determine whether it's a story or not before you actually go ahead and pitch it, to a journalist. So 5 W's would be who, what, when, where, and why. And H is the how. So who is it about? What has happened, which is why you think it's a story. When did it happen? Where did it happen? Why did it happen? And how it happened. If you can kind of answer these questions, these are useful tools to check, whether it's a story or not. And as a journalist, these are the basics. This is something that we always follow. And we consider this to be essential elements, when a reporter actually writes a news story. So before you actually pitch a story to a journalist, just think if you can tick mark all these 5 W's and 1 H, you can be sure that it's a story worth pitching to a journalist.
Right. I mean, again, going back to the very basics, we constantly hear this term, peg of the story. What is the story? Can you tell us like what the hell does that mean? What is a peg of a story?
Right. So when you talk about a peg, it's the crux of the story. A story could be anywhere from 400 words to 2000 words, even longer. But the story has a central theme, which is essentially the peg of the story. It's also called the story hook. And the reason, a reporter will choose to report a news story is based on the peg. And the peg often, makes the story very timely, which is, why are you kind of writing the story now? So the peg will kind of answer that question as well. Right. So that's essentially a peg or a story hook of a story.
Right. So let's just create a scenario, okay? And you tell me what the peg of that story would be for a non-profit. Okay. So recently, the Prime Minister mentioned about using Kisan drones, basically drones that should be used by farmers, and how the government is, planning to promote more on that front. So for an NGO that is working in the agriculture space or that is working with farmers, is there something that, they can pitch, maybe a story on something, on a similar work that they are doing?
So instantly in their past work, if they've ever used a drone, instantly it becomes a sell to a journalist, because the Prime Minister has announced this and they've already been doing this. So the peg becomes the fact that, the NGO has been using a drone and how it's kind of helped them and benefited them. So then it becomes a flow to the story.
So typically, for the last, 10, 12 years that you've been working in this space, you must have done like hundreds of stories, right? What is it that you actually look at when you're considering a story?
Firstly, I think the story needs to make sense to me. If there is something worth narrating to a larger audience, if I am clear on why I'm narrating this story, it makes for a story, at least for me. So clearly a story needs to have a unique angle or a unique element which makes it worth narrating, to the audiences. Take for example, if there is an initiative that is launched by an NGO, what I'll be looking at is, fine, you launched the initiative. That's not a story for me. But did this initiative actually have an impact on ground, whether it's community based or it's related to individuals who come from a specific category? So I would look at the impact that this story has had and whether it's improved or not improved. This is what I'll kind of look at, which will make it interesting for a reader. Otherwise, it becomes very hard to justify why you're writing the story. If it's just an announcement, like an NGO is launching X, well, fine. But what is the impact that X has had? So what you can do is essentially pitch a story a few months after the initiative has been launched, so that you yourself firstly can analyze, how it's had an impact. And this is what I would like to narrate when I'm writing the story.
Right. I mean, this is, I think, like the most difficult part, I guess, for NGOs, especially for people who have not been in this space or who do not understand the media space. Because like the times that I have interacted or when I work with non-profits, one of the things that, when I try to kind of understand if there is a story angle that I could pitch to journalists, then one thing that I find it difficult to get from the organization is that, like, or what is that most important thing. For example, like recently I was speaking to an organization. They work in the space of education. And this was my first or second interaction with them. So I didn't know about their work much in detail. So when I asked them, and one of their complaints was that they had been pitching stories to media houses and none of them picked up the story. I kind of had like a very quick sort of exercise just over a Zoom call. Just to understand that, are there any things, specific things, or there are specific angles that they could tell me, and, I could kind of make sense of it and I could suggest to them that this could be a potential story. And I had a discussion and we could not come up with anything, because typically the organization would tell me that, oh, we work in early education, childhood education, for example. Now that doesn't make a story, right? There has to be a story to it. There has to be...
Right.
So how does an organization kind of understand this?
Since you spoke about child education, let's talk about that. When you're on field, you can actually analyze for yourself the kind of impact your work has been having on the field. I think it's important to just sit down and try to look at what you've done and then kind of make sense of it. If it actually had, like I said, any kind of impact on the place that you've been working. Because all NGOs do a lot of stuff on the field, but analyzing what they've done, which is essentially what comes out in annual reports. But you don't wait till the end of the year. If you kind of just analyze it every week or every month, depending on how frequently you're kind of implementing the entire project, that step by step will give you a decent understanding of the kind of impact, the program has had.
And you think that would sort of help them identify what could be a potential story that they could pitch to a journalist?
Certainly. And then you're obviously going to check the 5 Ws and 1 H, because the peg is important, right? It has to be timely. So if something was launched in January, say at the end of Jan or mid-Feb would be a good time to do a first check on what kind of impact it's had. And over a period of time, it'll give you an understanding of, yes, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, that will give you an idea of what you need to tell a journalist, what the journalist needs to see and read to convince him that, yeah, this is a story worth writing.
Right. And would you say like something like, let's say data, for example, would you say that data would sort of help in pitching a particular story?
Absolutely. Data makes it very easy to kind of, understand impact with respect to a story. It's a start. It's not everything in a story, but when you're saying something in a story, the data will help you justify the statement that you're making at the start. And a lot of publications need that data. They'll ask you to get that data. In fact, not just the current data, they'll actually ask you to go back and look at the data a year ago, maybe a year before that, maybe compare it to data that's out there, from another part of the world maybe. So coming back, data isn't everything, but data is absolutely essential when you're narrating a particular story.
So can you give an example of how a data-driven story actually works? Is there anything that you have done that could kind of help people in this space just to understand what you're talking about?
So I think the easiest one, that comes to mind is I was in Bundelkhand at a school for farmers, and what the person there was trying to do was he was trying to bring them back to the traditional form of farming. So obviously farming is something that takes time, results, to analyze the results takes time. But over a period of 3 years, he could kind of see the impact that the traditional method of farming was having in terms of the volume of cultivation that was happening. So that data became an easy reference because the land was the same, but once he kind of implemented the traditional method of farming, which he learned through the farmer's school, there was a 3x increase in his produce. So that became an easy sell for me.
Right. So just to kind of sum up, so basically you need to have like a good data, something that you can back to your story, and then you need to have multiple examples of something similar that has happened to a bunch of people, not just one person.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
Right. So you have done like a lot of stories like with non-profits, and you've covered non-profit space as well. So what has been your experience been like?
Something that will be very relevant for this particular podcast is the fact that a lot of them don't know what they are actually pitching. So what happens is, whether it's a telephonic conversation or an email, they just tend to write a thesis, which is not the way to kind of approach a journalist, because sure, he might read through the whole thing, but while reading through the whole thing, the crux of the story might just get lost, it gets diluted. So a lot of them, what I have come to understand is, have great stories, but they just don't know how to kind of talk about it to a journalist. Often I have to sit down and read through a press note, or analyze a conversation that I've had with someone to understand, where is the story.
Right. Or maybe look at their annual report or their website or
Absolutely.
something.
I would love it if they would just feed it, in a 2-minute conversation, this is what happened, or a short press note saying this is what we're doing, or just send me data. Often if you just send me data, that's enough for me to kind of decide whether it's a story or not. And like I'm going back to what we were discussing, if it's clear, like the data is in front of you, it's very easy to understand that yes, project X has had this kind of an impact, and here is the data, and it becomes so easy for a journalist to sell the story.
Right. Because journalists get a lot of information from various sources and from various places, right? So I guess it's not possible. Feasible for a journalist to kind of go through each and every email that they get, because there's just tons of information that is coming in. So I guess what you're saying is, just if there is maybe a 2-sentence or a very short kind of just introduction or information about what the pitch is, that would essentially make it much more easier for any journalist to kind of.
You said 2 sentences, but I'm happy to read even 20 sentences if they're meaningful. If they help me understand that this is the story you're trying to get. This is the story you're trying to narrate. I don't mind reading 20 sentences, but make them meaningful. Just don't
bombard with information.
Yeah, don't just give me an entire history.
Right. I wanted to go over with you with some of the stories that you've done, like about NGOs and about some of the initiatives. So shall we start with the skateboarding story that you had done in Madhya Pradesh? Can you just walk us through, like, how did that story happen?
Sure. Through a friend, I heard about a skate park close to Panna. Now, for me, it was hard to believe, because skateboarding is a very urban sport. At least back then, it was very urban. Even today, you relate it to a lot of urban settings. So for me to kind of just hear that there is a skate park in the middle of nowhere was something that I wanted to go see for myself. I didn't have a contact, but even if I had a contact, I wouldn't call them, because this was something that I wanted to see with my own eyes. So I actually made the trip to Panna, and about 4 kilometers from Panna is a small village called Janwar. It now has network in certain spots, but back then it had no network. Resources were limited, but I reached there and there were little kids there, barefoot. There was a skate park there, and they were having a blast, skating around the rink. And uh, obviously the wow factor as a journalist remains for a short span. And then I try to look at the kind of impact, you know, a skate park like this would have, you know, on a community which was divided as Yadavs and Adivasis, and they wouldn't even mingle, you know, in the same village. They would lead separate lives. But because of the skate park, I could see Yadav and Adivasi kids playing together, you know, in the same space. Now, obviously, it raised a lot of eyebrows, okay? But over a period of time, this skate park started bringing about a lot of change. And today, I'm not saying everything is good, but there's been a difference. People are more accepting. The elders, actually, the adults are more accepting. But the kids, they don't even see the difference anymore. This is started by Ulrika Reinhardt, who's a German national who has worked in Skatistan, in Kabul. She's seen the impact, so she kind of decided to bring this here. And she came up with a simple rule: no school, no skateboarding.
Wow.
So, as kids typically do it, you know, you point fingers, hey, ye nahi aaya tha, ye nahi aaya tha. So, they would not be allowed to skate that day.
Right.
So, over a period of time, that kid who didn't go to school started going to school simply so that he could skate in the evening.
Right.
And pretty soon the attendance went up at school.
Right.
And initially, even the school teacher had his doubts, you know, what is happening? Because they're very resistant to change, you know, any form of change. But he slowly realized the impact, you know, that the skate park was having. So kids started going to school. I think that was fantastic. The second rule was girls first. So suddenly, I mean, obviously, it wasn't so easy. You know, even the boys there know the kind of settings, you know, around them. But today, if you go, girls are using an equal amount of, you know, the skate park as the boys. So they don't have to wait for their turn. They don't have to wait for the skate park to kind of be empty to actually, you know, go and skate there. So a lot of change has come about because of a simple skate park.
Right.
So this was, I mean, I'm just briefly telling you about the difference it's made.
What year are we talking about?
The first time I went there would be about 2014 or 15, not exactly sure, but it was a while.
5-6 years back.
Easily.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, for me, that was a story which I enjoyed working on, and I made it a point to keep going there, you know, every on like at regular intervals to kind of see for myself, you know, the change that's happening in that village. And kids are studying. A lot of them are now studying at Satna, which is near Janwar. A few have had exposure. You know, they've gone abroad skating. They speak English now. They're actually learning remotely. They have, you know, their guides sitting in a different part of the world, but now they have internet, so they're regularly talking to them. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a story. I mean, how did, when you came to know about this, like a lot of things must have not happened. I think a lot of the other developments that you mentioned are probably more recent. So when the first time you came across the story, how did you pitch it, and where did you pitch? Which publication did you pitch it to?
So I've written. So again, you know, I've written about different aspects of the barefoot skateboarders and what they do. So the first time that I wrote was simply the fact that here is a skate park in the middle of nowhere, and here are kids who they didn't know what was happening in their own village, and today, like, you know, they're skating, and obviously there was not much in terms of change back then, but the fact that at least, you know, kids from two communities are playing together, and the no school, no skateboarding rule came up quite early, so you could see that impact that kids are going to school,
Right.
you know.
Right.
So yeah, these are some of the initial observations that I had while I.
So initially it was just one story, but over a period of time you have done multiple stories about the organization, about the work that they do, and you've taken different angles to pitch that story and to various publications.
Certainly. So water is an issue in this part of Madhya Pradesh. So they actually looked at rainwater harvesting systems and to improve the groundwater condition, quality, and all of that. These are all subsequent things that kind of happened. Then I wrote about Asha and the kind of change she's bringing about in the community as a girl. So yeah, I've written about 4 or 5 stories based
So
on
when
this.
you say Asha, it's not the it's an individual and not the Asha program that you're referring to.
Oh no, Asha Gond is the girl
Right.
on whose life Skater Girl is essentially based.
Right. In fact, that brings me to my next question, which is how do organizations get journalists to cover their story, over a period of time and cover various angles and various like how do they kind of get to do that? Because generally the perception or generally the thing is that if you have pitched a particular story and if a journalist has written about you, he or she would not kind of cover you again, right? But in your case, it seems that you have done multiple stories over a period of time. So how can organizations get journalists to do that?
Every organization is continuously working. There is some projects which are active on ground, and obviously there are some which are in the pipeline. I think it's important for one person at an organization to take the responsibility to keep in touch with the journalist, and by that I don't mean call him every week, but keep him posted on future projects that are currently being tested and may be implemented in the time ahead. Let him know about the impact that a previous project has had and if there's any data related to it. If a constant connection is maintained, and I'm insisting on the fact that it's one person so that nothing is repetitive, right? Because journalists, they're working on a bunch of things. So that one person, that conversation has been maintained over a period of time, he'll know exactly what he's spoken to him the previous time.
Right.
So the next time around, you're updating, you're giving him more than that. And I'm trying to tell you how if another person talks, maybe he'll talk about the same thing again.
Correct.
So if you maintain this link,
so one person from the organization.
right? If one person keeps in touch with that journalist and keeps him posted on how things are progressing, because there's work happening every minute, every day.
Right.
That would keep the journalist, in the loop. And often, like at least for me, I'm waiting for a particular thing to happen. And the moment that happens, I know it's a story which is worth pitching.
Right.
So instead of being hasty, I would wait until I am convinced it's a story in my head. Because once you're convinced, trust me, as a journalist, it becomes an easy sell because you know exactly what you're selling.
Right.
But when there is a product, for example, which you haven't seen, it becomes difficult to sell it, right?
Correct.
Because you don't know what you're selling.
Correct.
But this kind of constant feedback, and constant updates that you get from an NGO make it very easy to kind of convince the journalist, when is the right time to pitch this story.
Right. Yeah. So just to kind of sum it up, so essentially what you're saying is like have one point person at the organization, and that point person should be in touch with the journalist. And perhaps I mean you have not said this, but let's say the person is kind of leaving the job or quitting the job, then that person should ideally do a handover to the next person who's joining it, and maybe make that connection so that there is a smooth transition, and that contact continues even beyond that person. So that's one. And secondly, you mentioned about how the organization should probably just keep the person in the loop, keep the journalist in the loop, so that there is any sort of updates, you can share it with that journalist on a personal note.
Oh yeah, I mean what you just mentioned about if someone's leaving the organization, he hands over whatever's been done so far to the next person. That would be absolutely amazing for a journalist, because yeah, I mean what more can I ask for, right? Like you're actually giving me information that I don't know from another person who has been kept in the loop.
Right.
So that would really be great for a journalist sitting anywhere, just to get that updated information from a completely different person.
Great. Yeah. So yeah, I wanted to. There was another story that you had done about, which I remember. I think you had covered a radio station, like a community radio station in Uttarakhand, Mandakini Ki Awaaz. Like, can you tell us how did that story happen, and what was it that what was the peg of that story? How did you come across that story?
Right. So the Kedarnath floods that happened, and the next year I was kind of traveling in the same area, and one of the things I wanted to see was the kind of obviously the damage that's happened because of the flood, and how the rehabilitation has kind of started off, and how it's kind of helped the people there. So while I was there, I was talking to someone and he told me about a community radio called Mandakini Ki Awaaz, and it became a very important tool for the people of that region, because typically when there's a natural disaster or communication lines are down. Now, through this radio station, what they started was alerts. So, for example, if there is a heavy rain forecast, the radio station took it upon themselves to kind of spread the word to the people in that region. So, it became an instant sell for me because the flood had happened, and now this radio station was using the tools that they had to keep people informed, because typically in mountains, people live very far. So a short distance could take many hours to kind of, cover. But through this radio station now, the word spread easily. So someone who is living remotely, if he knows that, there is heavy rain forecasted, he could probably come to a place from where he could have easy access in case things went wrong. So this radio station had a direct impact, for the future. So for me, it was a very easy pitch to kind of propose to the newspaper. I think I wrote this for the Hindu, that how this radio station is now, changing the lives of people there. And this was just one part of it. But through the radio station, they try to revive a lot of their songs and their loris and all of that. So a lot of Dadajis would sit with their grandchildren and tune in at 9 p.m. on a particular day. And then I saw them singing along, the same songs and all of that. So that is, of course, different. But the primary peg for this story was the fact that, in case of a natural disaster, now they have a local radio station which will alert them and kind of help out in case things go bad.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that there are so many stories that you have done, and we can go into each one of them like in detail. But I'm gonna now, like, because you're on my podcast, so I'm obviously going to do my plug here and also bring you to the other story that you had done about the Videsia project.
Well, I don't think it's a plug at all. I think that's some incredible work that you're actually doing. And I mean, it was a delight for me to kind of listen to your stories. Forget the fact that I wrote about it, because it's just some amazing work that you're doing. And yeah, thank you for letting me write about it.
Thanks, man. I wanted to speak to you about the fact that one of the stories that you did about the Videsia project, it got published in international publications. That's
Right.
Al Jazeera, right? So typically, I mean, as journalists, having worked in India and having understanding of this space, the media space, how to pitch a story to an Indian publication. But I'm sure the same. I mean, there is a lot of change when you pitch stories to international publications. So I wanted to understand from you, what is it that generally international publications look for? How can organizations and nonprofits pitch their story, not just to an Indian publication, but what is it that they need to keep in mind when they are pitching it to an international journalist or someone who writes for international publications?
So I'll talk in terms of this story. So Mahendra Mishra ji was the person that we wrote about, who was a Bhojpuri musician by day, let's put it that way. But he had a solid impact on the freedom movement because he used to print fake currency notes. Now, the songs that he wrote about was a lot about, the indentured labor and the migration that kind of happened during the British time. Then he had an impact with, the fake currency note printing, which he would give to revolutionaries to kind of fund the movement, This demanded a global audience, because indentured migration, like you would know, people went all across, the world. Again, India's independence movement is something that a global audience connects with. So in this particular case, my audience was beyond just, Indians. People across the world would be interested, in a story like this. And it's a fascinating story about one man who was sitting, in the heartland of India, and who was trying to make a difference in his own way. So his songs, I mean, the two sides to him. His songs spoke about, the migration and indentured labor, which is something that a lot of people don't know about. And then the currency that he printed kind of funded the entire independence struggle. So these are like unknown heroes who had a major impact on India back during their times. So it became very easy for me to kind of get this out, and Al Jazeera agreed because they probably, of course, saw the kind of impact the story had. And while I would have got this published in an Indian publication, I think personally, I thought the story deserved to kind of go out to a wider global audience, which is why I pitched it to Al Jazeera.
Right. So for people who don't know about indentured migration, so indentured migration is a migration that happened during the British Raj in India. It happened in the early 18th century, right up to 1917, like around that time, where British government then back at that time basically signed contracts with people mostly from UP and Bihar, and got them to work on contractual basis, and they essentially shipped them to colonies, British colonies across the world. So right from Fiji, Mauritius, Caribbean, and so on. So essentially, people signed like they could not read or write at that time, but they kind of put their thumb impressions on a piece of paper, and they were shipped to these countries, and they never came back. So just to kind of give a background about what indentured migration is.
Right.
Coming back to the story that you mentioned. So this story, because it was about independence movement, it was about a Bhojpuri folk artist. So there are different angles that you could have possibly taken, right? So in terms of the timeliness, the story could have been relevant maybe around 15th of August or 26th of January, or maybe even around like World Music Day, for example.
Absolutely, that's right.
Yeah. Right. So one of the ways that organizations can look at stories is to also try to see what are the important days in a year, and try to see if there are any stories or there is any potential story angle that they could pitch around that time.
Right. Obviously, based on the field that they're working
Absolutely.
in. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there'll be a bunch of days if they can just take a look. I think that'll make it very easy for the journalist if you connect with him 2 or 3 weeks in advance to let him know this day is coming up and we're doing this. Becomes again very easy for the journalist to put the story out.
Right. Okay. So I know one thing like about you in terms of, I know you hate press releases, like long press releases. But organizations even today, like they continue to, this is still one of the mediums through which organizations communicate about their work. I mean, do you see any value in receiving press releases from organizations?
Press releases are important because it becomes like it gives you a feeler of what is happening at the organization. We spoke about this in the past as well, wherein if you have to reach out to a bunch of journalists, the best way to do it is through a press release. That said, nobody has the time to read a lengthy press release. So a concise press release without spelling errors, like I mentioned before, would be great, just to give the journalist an idea of something that's happening, a new development. It could definitely be communicated through a press release.
Right. So while we have talked about everything, like a one fundamental question, how can organizations actually locate a journalist and like reach out to them? What is the best way to kind of go about? How does one go about?
Right. So when you're looking for journalists at a particular publication, it's many times it's very easy. It's their first name dot their last name at the group. So for example, if I were at Times of India, it would be shail.desai@timesgroup.com. If you just open newspapers, often you'll get the journalist's email address at the end of the story or at the start of the story. That said, I think it's critical to understand who you're pitching the story to. So, for example, if you are an NGO working in the environment space, it'll be silly to pitch the story to someone who's working in the education space. So, as an NGO, you also need to track journalists, and that's easy. You just have to read newspapers and you'll figure out which journalist is covering which beat, so it becomes very easy to kind of understand which journalists would be interested in your work, depending on the sector that you're coming in. And when it comes to an independent journalist like me, you can I'll drop in my email address. Please feel free to reach out with anything, because I mean, jokes apart, an independent journalist will be happy to write about any topic as long as it makes for a story for him or her. So when you're approaching an independent journalist, or the person is an independent journalist, feel free to reach out to him or her. And you can use social media. Most of them have a presence on social media.
So, except you, maybe?
No, I actually, I'm just lazy, but I have an active presence as well.
Right.
And I do check, my messages or my tweets or whatever it is. So yeah, I think that's the best way to kind of reach out to an independent journalist, and then it doesn't matter what field you're working in, because I'm pretty sure they'll be happy to hear you out.
Like, having done stories like about the NGO space, like, are there do you see that there is some reluctance in the mainstream or generally in the media space to do stories about to cover NGOs or cover this space?
Certainly. A lot of editors I talk to are always apprehensive about writing stories about NGOs, because there are just so many out there, and a lot of them, they don't do the work that they claim to be doing. So yeah, there is some reluctance, but that's where someone like me, who's out there and who's seen things for himself, can talk to the editor and let him or her know that I was there, and the fact that you were there on ground, half your job is done, because the editor knows that this is not something that's been fed to him over the phone. He's seen it, and he's writing what he saw. He's writing based on the field work, which is traditionally how a journalist used to be, the guy with a jolly walking around, seeing things and bringing news to other people.
Right.
So I think a journalist's credibility kind of depends on this. So I touch wood for whatever time I've been kind of working, I know now that when I say this is a story, my editors know that it is certainly a story, and it's not something where they need to doubt any particular thing. So
yeah. Right. So wow, we have covered a lot of ground, haven't we? So just to kind of sum it up, like, according to you, what would be the, let's say, top 3 takeaways from this session, or from that non-profits could take to when it comes to pitching a story to a journalist? What would top 3 things would be?
So I think first, be clear in your head, what is it that you're pitching to a journalist? So you can use the 5 W's and 1 H that we spoke about earlier. Be clear in your head first, then approach the journalist with what you think is the pitch. Secondly, use data to substantiate the pitch, because that is really effective, like I told you before. And third is be concise. When you're actually approaching a journalist, don't give him a whole lot of data, which confuses the person. So be crisp, be concise, just give him an idea, because eventually the journalist will be out on field and he'll do his own research to kind of write the story. So just give him an idea of what is it that you are talking about, and then let him decide how he wants to approach the story.
Wow. Thank you so much, Shail, for all your insights. We will put your email ID in the link below, so people can reach out to you directly if they have any stories. And hopefully you'll get a lot more leads after this podcast is out.
Certainly. I look forward to it. And thank you, Simit, for having me over.